Benedict Sterling had attended 243 balls in his 32 years. He remembered the exact number because he kept ledgers of everything: investments, property acquisitions, social obligations. He would not remember this one by its number. The ballroom at Montrose House smelled of hothouse roses and melted candle wax. The orchestra played a Viennese waltz. Benedict had come to discuss railroad shares with Lord Pemberton, but the conversation died mid-sentence when he saw the woman in crimson. She stood beneath the crystal chandelier, and the light caught the silk of her gown, not the pale pastels worn by every other lady present, but a red so deep it looked like wine held up to flame. Her dark hair was pinned loosely, exposing the curve of her neck. She was laughing. Actually laughing, head tilted back, one gloved hand resting on Lord Silas Vane's forearm. Benedict's chest constricted. The sensation was unfamiliar and unwelcome, like swallowing broken glass. The woman in red was his wife. Iris had chosen white roses for her bouquet. She'd spent 3 weeks selecting them, imagining her new husband might notice, might comment on their subtle fragrance. Benedict noticed the time. 11:30, he said, removing his pocket watch as they entered the ducal suite. I have correspondence to review before morning. The room was cold despite the fire. Iris stood in her wedding gown, ivory silk that had taken 4 seamstresses 2 months to complete, and watched her husband cross to the writing desk without looking at her. Your Grace, she began, voice steadier than her hands. I thought we might. We should establish expectations. He didn't turn around. His shoulders were perfectly squared beneath his black evening coat, his posture that of a man conducting business. This marriage serves a practical purpose. My uncle requires an heir to secure the succession. You require financial security and social position. These objectives do not necessitate companionship. The word tasted bitter in her mouth before he even said it. I've had the East Wing prepared for your use, Benedict continued, finally facing her. His eyes were gray, like January fog over the Thames. You'll find it comfortable. We'll dine together when social convention requires. Otherwise, I expect we'll both prefer separate lives. Iris felt something crack inside her chest. Not her heart breaking. That would come later, slowly, over weeks of empty breakfasts and dinners eaten in silence. This was different. This was the sound of hope dying. I see, she said quietly. Excellent. He returned to his correspondence. Good night, then. She left still wearing her wedding gown. The white roses were already wilting in their vase. The moment Iris stopped trying came on a Tuesday. She descended the main staircase at precisely 8 o'clock, as she had every morning for 5 months. The breakfast room overlooked the south gardens, where frost still clung to the hedgerows despite the April sun. Benedict sat behind his newspaper, The Times, always the Times, with his coffee cooling untouched beside his plate. Good morning, Iris said. The newspaper didn't lower. She'd prepared a comment about the Royal Academy exhibition, something to fill the silence that pressed against the walls like rising water. But as she opened her mouth, she caught her reflection in the silver coffee service. A pale ghost in a pale dress, speaking to a man who couldn't be bothered to acknowledge her existence. The words dissolved on her tongue. Instead, she picked up her teacup and drank in silence. The tea was bitter, oversteeped, the way she'd always hated, but she didn't add sugar. Why bother? Benedict wouldn't notice if she drank hemlock. After breakfast, she didn't go to the morning room to practice the pianoforte he'd never asked her to play. She went to the library and requested every book on architecture the household possessed. By afternoon, she'd had her trunks moved to the East Wing. Benedict came home to find her gone from the rooms adjacent to his. He stood in the empty dressing room, running his fingers along the bare marble vanity. The air still held traces of her lavender perfume. Something uncomfortable lodged itself beneath his sternum. He ignored it. The East Wing had better light. Iris discovered this her first morning waking in the blue bedroom 3 corridors away from her husband. Sunlight streamed through windows that faced the riding grounds, turning the dust motes into suspended gold. She could hear the stable hands exercising the horses, their calls floating up through the glass. She hadn't ridden since arriving at Stirling Hall. By noon she was in the stables wearing a riding habit she'd forgotten she owned, deep navy instead of her usual pale blue. The mare the groom brought was called Tempest, a name that had seemed too spirited for a duchess. Now it felt exactly right. Benedict's secretary found him in his study surrounded by quarterly reports. "Your Grace, the Duchess has taken out Tempest. Should I send? My wife may ride whichever horse she chooses." Benedict didn't look up from his calculations. Was there anything else? There wasn't. But an hour later, Benedict found himself at the window overlooking the eastern pastures. A figure in dark blue galloped across the field, bent low over the horse's neck, moving with a grace he'd never witnessed in the stiff, formal woman who sat across from him at dinner. The uncomfortable sensation in his chest intensified. He pulled the curtains shut and returned to his ledgers. The numbers refused to make sense for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, Iris didn't come to dinner. Lady Hartfield's dinner party was the most tedious event of the season, which meant attendance was mandatory. Benedict arrived at 8 as precisely as he did everything. He found his name card at the head of the table, beside Lady Gresham's tedious daughter. Iris's card was placed 6 seats away, between Lord Silas Vane and the young Marquis of Thornbury. He felt his jaw tighten. Vane was known for 3 things: a dissolute reputation, a brilliant mind for politics, and an unsettling charm that made married women forget their vows. The man collected hearts the way Benedict collected property deeds. When Iris entered, Benedict's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. She wore green. Not the modest sage she'd worn to every previous event, but emerald that clung to her figure and made her skin luminous in the candlelight. Her hair was arranged differently, softer, with small diamond pins that caught the light when she moved. She didn't look at him. Instead, she smiled at Vane, who pulled out her chair with the exaggerated gallantry of a man who knew exactly how handsome he was. "Lady Sterling," Vane said loud enough for Benedict to hear, "you grow more radiant each time I see you. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "How kind, Lord Vane." Her voice carried a warmth Benedict had never heard directed at him. "Though I suspect you say that to every lady present. Only the interesting ones." She laughed. The sound pierced through the dinner conversation like crystal breaking. Benedict's fork bent slightly in his grip. Benedict had never been a man ruled by impulse. Yet he found himself watching his wife with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The way she tilted her head when Vane spoke. The way her fingers traced the stem of her wine glass. The way she seemed perfectly content, happy, in a room where he existed only as a distant formality. Across the table, she debated the merits of Gothic architecture with the passion she'd never shown discussing anything with him. Her eyes were bright, animated, alive. When had she become interesting? The thought arrived unwelcome and insistent. It dragged with it a parade of other observations: the elegant line of her neck, the intelligence in her comments, the way other men leaned closer when she spoke. Lord Thornbury was staring at her mouth. Benedict's knife scraped against porcelain, the sound sharp enough to draw glances. He set it down with deliberate care, muscle memory overriding the urge to do something spectacularly uncharacteristic, like standing up and announcing that every man at this table should remember his wife was married to him. After dinner, the ladies withdrew. Benedict endured 20 minutes of port and political talk before escaping to find Iris. She stood on the terrace, silhouetted against the garden lights. "Iris." She turned. For one moment he saw surprise flicker across her face. Then it smoothed into polite neutrality. "Your Grace. Did you need something?" "Your Grace." Not Benedict. Not even my lord. "I thought we might speak." "How unusual." She smiled, but it was a cold, polite thing sharp as glass. "What would we discuss? The weather? Your railway investments? Or perhaps you'd like to schedule our next obligatory public appearance?" The words hit like a slap. Benedict prided himself on logic, on seeing patterns in numbers and finding solutions to complex problems. He could not solve his wife. She attended every social function required of her position. She smiled appropriately. She wore beautiful gowns. She never created scandal or embarrassment. She also never spoke to him unless absolutely necessary. At the Pemberton Musicale, he watched her discuss botanical illustration with the Countess of Montrose. At the theater, she laughed at the comedy while he sat rigid in the ducal box, hyper-aware of every man's gaze that lingered on her. At Lady Weatherby's garden party, he found her reading Wollstonecraft in the shade, a book that would have scandalized half the ton, with the kind of absorbed focus he'd only ever seen her direct at him once. On their wedding night, when she'd looked at him with something that might have been hope, he'd extinguished it with clinical efficiency. The realization arrived late one night as he sat alone in his study. The east wing was dark. Iris had retired hours ago. The distance between their bedrooms suddenly felt insurmountable, though he could cross it in perhaps 3 minutes. He'd asked for separate lives. She'd given him exactly what he requested. The feeling in his chest wasn't discomfort. It was regret, sharp and consuming, wrapped around something more dangerous. What? He wanted his wife. Not the invisible ghost who'd haunted his breakfast table for months, but this woman, the one who rode tempest like she was racing the wind, who debated with Silas Vane, who'd stopped looking at him entirely. Benedict set down his pen and stared at the ledgers that had always made sense. Nothing made sense anymore. Do you think he deserves a second chance? Will Iris ever forgive the man who broke her heart with cold indifference? Subscribe to find out what happens when a duke who's never begged for anything in his life discovers the one thing he can't buy is the love he threw away. The Montrose ball was where everything shattered. Benedict had arrived late, detained by a meeting with his solicitors that had run past schedule. He disliked tardiness. It suggested a lack of control, but the contracts required his signature before morning. He entered the ballroom scanning for his wife out of habit. A habit that had formed without his permission over the past 3 weeks, this compulsion to locate her in every crowded room, to catalog who stood too close, who made her smile. Then he saw the dress. Crimson silk that moved like liquid fire. It was cut lower than anything she'd worn before, the neckline bordering on scandalous, the fabric clinging to curves he'd trained himself not to notice. She stood beneath the chandelier, and the light turned her into something otherworldly, a phoenix rising from the ashes of the meek girl he'd married. Silas Vane's hand rested at the small of her back. The ballroom tilted. Benedict's vision narrowed to that single point of contact. Vane's fingers against red silk, proprietary and familiar. Iris was laughing at something Vane had said, her face tilted up toward him with an openness that felt like a knife between Benedict's ribs. She'd never looked at him like that. Sterling. Lord Pemberton appeared at his elbow, oblivious. Didn't expect to see you tonight. Thought you'd be buried in those railway contracts. Benedict walked away mid-sentence. He moved through the crowd with singular focus, ignoring greetings, brushing past debutantes and their matchmaking mothers. The orchestra was playing a waltz. Vane was leading Iris toward the dance floor. Vane. Benedict's voice cut through the music. Both of them turned. Vane's smile was lazy, knowing. Iris's expression remained perfectly neutral. Sterling, Vane drawled. We were just discussing. I need to speak with my wife. Iris had forgotten how tall her husband was. Or perhaps she'd trained herself not to notice. Benedict stood before her in his perfectly tailored black evening coat, his cravat tied with mathematical precision, his gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that would have thrilled her 6 months ago. Now it only made her tired. Your Grace. She kept her voice light, social. Is something wrong? We need to speak. Privately. How fascinating. We've been married half a year and you've never expressed that particular need before. She turned back to Silas. Lord Vane, I believe you were telling me about the debate in Parliament. Benedict's hand closed around her wrist. Not painfully, but firmly enough that she felt the heat of his palm through her glove. The contact sent something electric up her arm, a traitorous response she resented. Now Iris. She met his gaze and saw something unfamiliar there. Something wild beneath the careful control, like storm clouds gathering behind glass. Very well. She withdrew her hand with deliberate slowness. Excuse us, Lord Vane. Silas's expression suggested he understood exactly what was happening. Of course. Though I expect you to save me the supper dance, Lady Sterling. Benedict's jaw clenched so hard she heard his teeth click. He guided her through the French doors onto the terrace with his hand hovering at her back, not quite touching but close enough that she felt the heat. The night air was cool against her flushed skin. Behind them, the ballroom glittered with 1,000 candles, but out here, shadows pooled between the stone columns. "What?" Benedict said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do you think you're doing?" Iris turned to face him, surprise temporarily overriding caution. "I beg your pardon? That dress. Vane. You're making a spectacle." Something ignited in Iris's chest, not hurt but fury. "A spectacle." She repeated the word slowly, tasting its acid. "How extraordinary. I've attended 43 social events as your Duchess. I've smiled and curtsied and made pleasant conversation while you've treated me like an inconvenient piece of furniture. Not once have you objected to my conduct. You've never worn a dress like that before. You've never noticed what I wear." The words hung between them, sharp and true. Benedict's hands flexed at his sides and she recognized the gesture. He did it when the ledgers wouldn't balance, when something refused to fit into his carefully ordered world. "I notice," he said finally. "Since when?" She laughed, the sound brittle. "Since Silas Vane started paying me attention? Since other men started looking at me the way you never have? That's not—" He stopped, his composure cracking at the edges. "You're my wife." "Yes. And you made abundantly clear what that means." She stepped closer, close enough to see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "We have separate lives, Benedict. You requested it. I'm simply honoring your wishes. Things have changed." "Have they?" She tilted her head, studying him the way she might examine an interesting insect. "Tell me, what color were my eyes when you married me? What's my favorite book? Do you even know where I spend my days?" He stared at her and she watched realization bloom across his face. He didn't know. He'd never asked. "That's what I thought." She turned toward the ballroom. "Now if you'll excuse me, Lord Vane is waiting." Benedict caught her arm and spun her back. "Don't." The word came out raw, stripped of its usual polish. "Don't what?" she challenged. "Don't enjoy myself? Don't let another man treat me like I matter? Don't look at him the way you used to look at me?" The confession hung in the air between them, stunning them both. Benedict had not intended to say that. He'd come out here with a plan, cool rationality, a logical discussion about appropriate conduct. Instead, he was unraveling like poorly spun thread, and his wife was watching it happen with something that looked almost like pity. "I don't look at you at all anymore," Iris said quietly. "You made sure of that." The words cut deeper than any blade. "I was wrong." The admission tasted foreign on his tongue. Benedict Sterling did not make mistakes. He calculated, he planned, he executed with precision. Except he'd miscalculated catastrophically, and the evidence stood before him in crimson silk, beautiful and utterly unreachable. "You were honest," Iris corrected. "You wanted a broodmare and a hostess, not a wife. I've tried very hard to give you exactly that. I don't want that." His voice had gone hoarse. "Not anymore." "How convenient. You've decided to want me now that someone else does." She'd struck the truth dead center. Benedict felt it like a physical blow, the jealousy that had been eating him alive for weeks, the rage that consumed him every time Vane touched her, the sick twist in his gut when she smiled at other men with the warmth she'd once offered him. "Yes," he said, because lies had gotten him nowhere. "I'm jealous. I'm furious. I can't sleep because I know you're 3 corridors away and I have no right to go to you. I can't work because I'm wondering who you're talking to, who's making you laugh, whether Vane has the audacity to." He cut himself off, breathing hard. Iris's eyes had gone wide. "You have no right to be jealous." "I know." He stepped closer into her space, close enough to smell her perfume. Something different now, richer than the lavender she'd worn before. "I have no right to anything. I threw away every claim to you the night we married." Iris should have walked away. 6 months of cold indifference, of eating breakfast across from a man who treated her like wallpaper, of crying silently in the East Wing, all of it demanded she turn and leave him standing here with his belated regrets. But his hands were shaking. Benedict Sterling, the Duke of Precision, the man who controlled everything from his cravat to his investments with mathematical exactitude, was shaking. "What do you want?" she whispered. "You." The word came out desperate. "I want you to move back to the West Wing. I want to know what you're reading. I want to hear about your rides on Tempest. I want—" He stopped, his control finally splintering completely. "I want to deserve you, and I have no idea how." Something in her chest cracked open. "You can't just decide you want me now, Benedict. That's not how this works." "I know." He lifted one hand, hovering it near her cheek without quite touching. "But I'm asking anyway. Let me try. Let me, God, Iris, let me court my own wife." The absurdity of it almost made her laugh. "Court me?" "Yes, properly. The way I should have from the beginning." His eyes searched hers, gray and desperate and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen them. "I'll do it right this time. I'll read every bloody book you recommend. I'll learn what makes you smile. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for being the world's greatest fool." "And what happens when you lose interest? When the novelty wears off and I'm just the inconvenient wife again?" "That won't happen." "You can't promise that." "No," he admitted. "But I can promise I'll try every single day. I can promise you'll never doubt you matter again." His hand finally touched her face, fingertips grazing her jaw with devastating gentleness. "I can promise that even if you never forgive me, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it." Iris closed her eyes against the tears threatening to spill. She'd imagined this conversation 100 times in those first lonely months. In her fantasies, she'd been cold, dismissive, victorious in her indifference. She'd never imagined how much it would hurt to see him broken. "One chance," she whispered. "If you waste it—" He kissed her. Not the perfunctory brush of lips from their wedding ceremony, but a real kiss, desperate and seeking and flavored with something that tasted like salvation. His hands framed her face like she was precious, like she was the only thing keeping him tethered to earth. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll grovel spectacularly," he promised. "I'll write you poetry. Terrible poetry. I'll learn to waltz properly so I can dance with you at every ball. I'll fire anyone who looks at you wrong." "Oh, Benedict." "Yes." "Stop talking and kiss me again." He did. Behind them, the ballroom music swelled. Inside, Silas Vane would be searching for her, no doubt amused by the inevitable conclusion. Tomorrow, the Tun would whisper about the Duke and Duchess of Sterling disappearing together, about the way they'd returned with her lipstick smudged and his cravat askew. But tonight, under the stars, with her husband's hands tangled in her hair and his heart finally beating against hers, Iris Sterling decided that some things were worth a second chance. Even dukes who'd been catastrophically wrong. Even love that had to be fought for. Even marriage that started 6 months too late. The Duke of Sterling spent the next 47 years proving himself worthy. He never quite succeeded. Iris remained the better part of him, but he died at 81 with her hand in his, having loved her spectacularly every single day. Some vows, it turns out, are worth breaking. Especially the ones made in fear rather than faith.